So our objective for these kinds of birds, whether they are fancy birds or production birds, meat birds, they are young, rapidly growing birds. And so we need to feed them as such. These could be roasters or turkeys, a little bit longer growing period. Turkeys, depending on what you want, could be anywhere from 12 to 20 weeks. Roaster chickens typically around 9 or 10 weeks, and then the typical fryer is usually 6 to 8 weeks, depending upon breed and management system, how fast they grow. There's a lot of variation. Egg production birds, they're being grown from young birds through adulthood up until they reach sexual maturity and beyond. And so what we're trying to do here with our feeding is to give them a sustained growth. We don't need maximum growth on laying birds. We want them to get to weight at the time that they are ready to lay eggs at 16 or 18 weeks of age. So we want them to maximize their weight there. We don't need them big when they're small because it's not they're heavy when they're young. We don't need them that way. We want them at the proper weight at a certain period of time. And so we're going to feed them towards that. And then as they are adults, we're going to feed them for maximum egg production, which is, so we're going to feed them in ways that they can maximize their egg production, have high quality eggs, both internal contents and shell. If we're looking at these recreation birds, we're going to grow them to follow a standard, some kind of a standard, that the standard of perfection, the American Poultry Association tells you what the standard is supposed to look like. We want them to have proper feather development because that's really what we're looking at on the outside of the bird is their feathers. We'd like to have good egg production, but it doesn't have to be maximum egg production, just good production. And then we want them healthy into advanced age. So some of these birds are going to be around laying eggs 2, 3, even 4 years. Generally, once they get to that age, 3, 4 years of age, they begin to start to drop off on their egg production. Because consider the amount of eggs that they produce, that's a lot. He's doing a lot of work. And so it's a drain on them as they continue to lay eggs. And then again, on the game birds and waterfowl, proper growth rate and egg production, what we're growing them for. And that's really based on their species. And then there's a lot of variability in management and feeding with the game birds compared to chickens. With game birds, we're dealing with multiple species. With chickens, they're all the same. They're all chickens. So they all have different breed types, but their feeding is more or less the same. And that's not necessarily true in the game birds. Now, as we start to think about feeding poultry in general, we need to consider their biology. They are a simple-stomached animal, which means they're a monogastric, which means they're similar, not identical certainly, but they're similar to our own digestive system. They are certainly closer to a human in their digestion than they are a sheep or cow, which are ruminants. And so they have a different requirement than do the monogastrics. So we need to feed them in such a way that we can maximize their available nutrients. When we consider their biology, then we look at the nutritional requirements. We have to make some decisions. There are ingredients versus nutrients. We feed nutrients by giving them ingredients. Ingredients are things like corn or oats or soybean or peas or whatever. Those are ingredients. Each one of those ingredients has a whole variety of nutrients in them. Their requirements are nutrients. And so we need to understand what the nutrient requirements are and then put together a mixture of ingredients to fulfill those nutrients. And while we're doing this, we need to have them have a balanced diet. That's the same thing that we need. In humans, we call it our recommended daily allowance. So if you look on your food labels, it usually has something about fat and carbohydrates and sugars, maybe sodium. And on that label, it will say this has 165 calories, where your which is 10%, let's say, of your daily requirement, and then it will have these. And that's what they're doing, is they're talking about balancing the diet. Monogastric animals need the same thing. Ruminant animals, cattle, sheep, goats, anything that grazes, they don't need the same kind of balance that that monogastrics need, because of the nature of their digestion. They're digesting grass, and they're utilizing microbes in their gut, just that grass. Once that grass is digested, not only do they get the value out of the grass, but they get the microbes as well. And so it's a little less precise in ruminants than it is in monogastrics. A typical monogastric requires a relatively high protein and a relatively low fiber. Fiber meaning cellulose, and we want that something less than 5 or 6% in the diet. And protein, generally for production birds, we're something above 16% protein, depending upon species and production. In chickens, generally the highest protein we're going to feed chickens is around 23%, and that would be for young growing broilers. We're going to drop that as they get older. In laying birds, we're going to generally start them at a lower protein diet and then end them up at around 15 or 16%. And then not only is that protein need to be relatively high, but that needs to have the proper ratio of amino acids. Protein is a long chain compound full of amino acids. There are about 20 amino acids that that are necessary. Some of which are what we call essential, and we'll get to that in a minute. Essential mean they have to be in the diet. And so we need to have certain amino acids. Chickens really do not have a protein requirement. You do not have to feed them 15% protein, 16% protein. What that is that's the combination of the amino acids. And if you have all the amino acids at exactly the ratio they require, you can probably get away with a 12% diet. But when you feed ingredients, many of those ingredients don't have all the amino acids at the proper level. So typically we end up giving them a high total protein to make sure we hit all the thresholds of the amino acids. And then typically in poultry, we use a phase feeding process. Phase feeding meaning the phase of their life. And so when you go to the feed store and purchase sack feed, you get a starter diet, or you get, harder to get nowadays, but a grower diet or grower developer, or we get a layer ration for laying birds. We get a turkey starter specifically for turkeys that are young birds. So this is phase. So we start them, we feed them for a few weeks on a start diet, and then we change them to some kind of grower or developer, and then we change them to some kind of a layer ration. That's phase feeding. We use that routinely in poultry. To understand a little more, here is the digestive system of a chicken. It's very simple on a relative scale with others. They have a beak, of course, and they don't have any teeth. There's no extant birds, existing birds that have teeth. Some extinct birds have had teeth. They were mostly seabirds, like penguins, but they no longer exist. And so they eat with a beak. They tend to swallow everything whole, or they try to tear it. If they can, they'll tear it into smaller pieces and swallow it. But they're going to swallow it whole. They have no way of chewing anything with teeth. They don't have teeth. That will come later in the system. Connecting to the crop is the esophagus, which is just the tube that goes from the mouth down to the crop. Now the crop is a storage organ. It has the function similarly to the stomach of a mammal in the fact that you can store things there for a period of time. Very little digestion goes on. It's mainly just storage. And so when you watch birds consume, they will sit and they will gorge for a period of time, when they stand up and walk away, especially chickens, broilers in particular, you will see at the top of their breast, the base of their neck, in the front, there will be this big lump. That's the crop full of feed. And then they will generally go and sit down, and then over the course of time, a few hours, that feed will evacuate out of the crop, go down into the proventriculus, which is considered the glandular stomach. This is where hydrochloric acid is released to begin the breakdown. It softens up the feed. It gets into the gizzard. Now the gizzard takes the place of the teeth. It grinds the feed. So it's going to be grinding the harder parts. If you are ranging your birds, they're eating whole grains or they're eating insects, a lot of hard-bodied insects like beetles or mealworm, things of that nature. It's a good idea to make sure they have some kind of grit because the grit will reside in the gizzard. They'll eat it, they'll swallow it, it'll stay in the gizzard and then acts as kind of like a mortar and pestle. It stones inside of the gizzard and it grinds the grain or the carapace of the insects so that they can be ground up. Once it's got a small enough particle size, it goes into that first loop of the small intestine, that's the duodenal loop, and there it's infused with enzymes from the pancreas and bile from the liver, and that helps the digestion process. So all the digestion here is chemical from here on, and so as it moves through the small intestine, those enzymes are acting on all of those ingredients, separating out the nutrients. The nutrients, when they get to their smallest size, they go through the membrane, through the digestive system into the bloodstream and are distributed. By the time we get down to the small intestine ends where the large intestine begins, at the bottom end, you can see there are like two little wings sticking out, and the cloaca becomes kind of bulbous. That's the end of the small intestine, beginning of the large intestine. The large intestine is quite short in a bird, particularly chickens, maybe 2 or 3 inches tops. Its main function is to draw back water, and so it's going to resorb a lot of the water. So when the waste is eliminated, then it tends to be relatively dry in most cases. Now the 2 paired ceca that are there that look like wings, in a chicken, an adult chicken, they're about the size of a pencil. And they are there for fermentation, also some immune response. They are useful, but they're not necessary for a bird. Chicken, they can be removed and the bird will survive just fine. Kind of think about them in terms of an appendix in a human. That's kind of the same thing. They have a useful purpose. In the old days, we thought the appendix in a human didn't have any value, was vestigial, and it's really not. It has an immune function and other things. But you can live just fine without it, and chickens can do that with this. Every once in a while, you'll notice your chicken will defecate a dark mass with their droppings. It has a lot of odor to it. Those are cecal droppings. That's eliminating from the ceca. And because it's fermented, it tends to have more odor with it. So that's basically a very simple digestive system for a chicken. The whole process from the time she eats to the time that the waste is eliminated is around 6 to 8 hours. So it goes very rapidly. In a mammal, it's closer to 24 hours, but in birds, it's very quick.